The rope cut into Eliza's wrists so deep she could almost feel her pulse hammering against the coarse fibers. Her back was pressed hard against the rough trunk of a towering pine, bark scraping her skin every time she shifted. The late afternoon. Sun hung low, burning the edges of the sky in shades of orange and crimson, casting long shadows that crept across the clearing. She tried to breathe, but the air was thick with pine resin, dust, and fear. Across from her stood James Carter, boots planted wide in the dry soil, spurs jingling faintly as he rocked on his heels. His laughter rolled out sharp and bitter, echoing through the trees like a rattlesnake's warning. At 35, James still carried the swagger of a younger man who thought the world bent to him, but time had carved bitterness into the lines of his face. His gray eyes glinted with something darker than mischief, something mean and unresolved. "You thought I'd forget?" James sneered, tugging at his leather gloves as though tightening them for the work ahead. "A woman thinks she can slap me in front of a whole saloon and just walk away? You stole my pride, Eliza. Ain't a man alive who forgets that." The words landed heavier than the rope around her wrists. Memories surged in Eliza's mind dust, swirling in the lamplight of the crowded saloon, her hand flying across his face when he grabbed her arm too roughly, the sound of her palm cracking against his cheek, and the stunned silence of the room before the drunken laughter erupted. That slap had been her only weapon, her only stand against him, and it had haunted James ever since. Her voice was hoarse, but she forced the words out. "It was years ago. Let it die, James." He smirked, a grin that carried no warmth. "Years? You think time matters to a man's pride? Every time I walk through that town, I hear it. Every whisper, every laugh behind my back. That slap turned me into a fool. Today, I take back what you stole." He leaned closer, boots crunching on pine needles, his breath sour with whiskey. Eliza turned her head away, the rope biting deeper as she strained against it. Her heart pounded not just from fear of James, but from the sickening truth that no one knew she was here. No one would come. The forest was too quiet. Even the cicadas had hushed, as though nature itself was waiting for something. James's laughter filled the silence again, harsher this time, unsteady. It was the laughter of a man trying to drown out his own insecurities to prove something not just to Eliza, but to himself. He rested his hand on the pistol at his hip, fingers twitching. "You'll beg before this is over. And when you do, I'll—" The sound stopped him cold. A twig snapped in the distance, clean and sharp, like a warning. James's head jerked up, eyes narrowing into the trees. The sun dipped lower, and with it came a shadow that stretched long across the clearing. The air shifted, cooler now, heavy with a presence Eliza couldn't explain but felt deep in her bones from between the pines. A figure emerged. He was tall, broad-shouldered, his bronzed skin glistening with sweat from the heat of the day. Long black hair spilled down his back, strands catching the last rays of sunlight like threads of midnight. Around his neck and arms hung tribal jewelry, beads, bone and silver that clinked softly as he moved. His eyes, dark as obsidian, fixed on James with an intensity that froze the smirk on the older man's lips. The warrior's steps were steady, deliberate, moccasins whispering against the earth. He carried no gun, no blade visible, yet his presence was more dangerous than any weapon James could draw. The clearing seemed to bend around him, the weight of silence pressing down until even James's breath sounded too loud. Eliza's heart leapt, a strange mix of hope and dread. She didn't know this man, had never seen him before, but she felt something in him, an unspoken power, a history carved into every line of his body. "He wasn't here by chance," James scoffed, though his voice faltered. "This ain't your business, stranger." The warrior said nothing, but the air itself seemed to answer for him. He stepped closer, shadows wrapping around him like a cloak, his gaze never leaving James. Eliza realized in that moment the scene had changed. She wasn't alone anymore. And James Carter, with all his bluster and rage, was no longer in control. Laugh that had haunted her moments ago died in James's throat. For the first time in years, she saw fear flicker in his eyes. The rope was still tight around her wrists, but Eliza felt a surge of something she hadn't felt since the day she slapped him in the saloon Defiance. This was no longer a reckoning between her and James. This was something larger, older, and far more dangerous, and it had just begun. James Carter spat into the dirt, the thick glob landing between his boots. His jaw tightened as he squared his shoulders, trying to mask the sudden unease gnawing at him. He had faced outlaws with bounties on their heads, brawlers twice his size, and drunken mobs in saloons, but this silent warrior emerging from the trees unsettled him in ways he couldn't explain. "You don't belong here," James growled, forcing bravado into his voice. His hand hovered closer to his pistol, the polished steel glinting faintly in the dying light. The warrior did not answer. He only moved one step closer, his moccasins soundless on the forest floor. The beads and bones strung across his chest shifted with emotion, clicking softly like whispers of the dead. His gaze, dark and unblinking, was locked on James with a kind of focus that stripped away pretense. It wasn't the gaze of a man sizing up an enemy. It was the gaze of a man who had already decided the outcome. Eliza, still bound to the pine tree, could hardly breathe. Every nerve in her body hummed with fear and fragile hope. This was no chance encounter, she felt it deep in her bones. The warrior's arrival had the weight of inevitability, as though the world itself had conspired to bring him here at this very moment. James barked out a laugh. "Too sharp, too forced. Come on, stranger. This is between me and her. Best you turn around and forget what you saw." He tipped his hat back, trying to reclaim that smugness, that swagger he always wore like armor. But the crack in his voice betrayed him. The warrior's silence stretched on, heavy as thunder before a storm. Finally, his voice came a low, steady rumble, rich with the cadence of rivers and mountains, carrying the gravity of generations. "I know you," he said. James blinked, startled. "The hell you mean, you know me?" The warrior stepped forward again, the last rays of sunlight carving his form into bronze and shadow. His voice remained calm, but there was steel beneath it. "You are Carter, cattle thief, bringer of fire. My family's land burned beneath your rider's hooves." Eliza's breath caught. She had heard whispers in town years ago about James's dealings, how he and a gang of ranchers had driven families off fertile land, how smoke had blackened the sky. But the townfolk had let it pass, soothed by bribes and whiskey. She hadn't known the depth of it, hadn't realized those whispers were flesh and blood standing here now. James stiffened. His grin faltered. "That was a long time ago," he muttered, eyes flicking toward Eliza as if to remind himself of the control he still held. "A man does what he must to survive." The warrior's expression didn't change, but his words cut like a blade. "Survival is not cruelty. You took more than land. You took lives. My sister, my father. Their blood still feeds this soil." 4. The first time since she'd been tied to the tree, Eliza saw fear flicker across James's face, not the fear of danger, but the fear of being exposed, of past sins clawing their way back into the light. He tried to recover, forcing a smirk. "So that's it. You came all this way to play hero for her?" He jerked his chin toward Eliza. "She slapped me once, humiliated me in front of the whole town. Now she pays the price. Ain't got nothing to do with you." The warrior's eyes flicked to Eliza, then back to James. Something unspoken passed between them, a vow, a recognition that this wasn't just about her. Eliza realized it then. Her slap may have sparked James's thirst for petty revenge, but the warrior's wound ran deeper. This was no mere chance of timing. This was a collision of histories. The air grew colder as dusk settled fully into the forest, shadows stretching long and jagged across the clearing. Somewhere in the distance a wolf howled, the sound chilling in its timing. Eliza's heart hammered against her chest. She knew James would not back down, not with his pride staked on this moment. But the warrior had not come to leave. 2 men stood in the clearing, one driven by bruised ego, the other by unhealed scars. And she was bound between them, her fate caught in the crossfire of vengeance older and deeper than she'd imagined. The pine needles rustled overhead as the wind shifted. The stage was set, and nothing would remain the same after tonight. The forest held its breath. Even the cicadas seemed to have hushed, their usual drone replaced by a silence so taut it hummed in Eliza's ears. Bound against the pine, she could feel every grain of bark biting into her back, every pulse of blood in her wrists as the rope cut deeper. Sweat trickled down her temple, not just from the heat of the fading sun, but from the unbearable weight of the moment unfolding before her. James Carter shifted his boots, spurs jingling faintly, though his eyes betrayed his nerves. His hand lingered near his holster, fingers twitching as though aching to draw, yet restrained by the gaze locked on him. Across from him, the warrior stood still, shirtless, bronzed skin gleaming with the last light of day, long black hair shifting with the evening wind. His chest rose and fell slowly, deliberately, beads and bones strung across his torso glinting as if catching fire from the sunset. The standoff stretched long enough that Eliza's breath came shallow, the anticipation suffocating. James tried to laugh again, though it came out brittle. "You just gonna stand there staring at me? Or you gonna do something about it?" He barked the words, but the tremor in his voice betrayed him. The warrior's expression didn't change. He stepped forward once, the ground crunching beneath his moccasins. That single step carried more weight than 100 threats. His voice came low, steady, like thunder before a storm. "You hide behind iron," he said, his gaze flicking to the revolver at James's hip. "But iron cannot shield you from truth." Eliza's pulse quickened. She'd never heard a voice so controlled, so calm, and yet it carried the bite of something ancient. She sensed this wasn't just about her anymore. This clearing had become a stage for something larger, a reckoning born of old wounds. James bristled, anger surging to mask his unease. "Truth? You want to talk truth?" He spat into the dirt, stepping forward now, trying to reclaim the ground he felt slipping away. "The truth is, this woman slapped me in front of half the damn town. I was made a joke, a laughingstock. Men looked at me different, women too. You think I'm letting her walk free? You think I'm letting her go without showing her what happens when you make a fool out of me?" Eliza closed her eyes, pain twisting her gut, not just for herself but for the smallness of it all. All this, every ounce of cruelty James had poured into her life, stemmed from that one slap. A single act of defiance had cracked his pride so deeply that he'd carried the wound like a brand all these years. But when she opened her eyes again, she saw the warrior hadn't flinched. His voice cut through James's tirade, low and deliberate. "A slap does not break a man, but pride can poison him." The words hung heavy, sinking into the clearing like stones into water. James's face darkened, the veins in his neck bulging as he stepped closer. His hand hovered just inches from his revolver now, every muscle taut. "Enough talk," he hissed. "You think you can walk into my business, into my land, and tell me what I am?" The warrior took another step, his presence filling the space, until even the trees seemed to bow to it. "This land is not yours," he said, voice rising just slightly, the edge of steel sharpening his tone. It never was. You carry only the weight of stolen soil and stolen lives. Eliza's heart pounded. She could see James' unraveling anger tightening every muscle, pride dragging him toward a choice he might not survive. The warrior, by contrast, radiated unshakable calm, the stillness of a mountain bracing for a storm. The last light of day bled into night, the clearing cloaked in shadows. James's hand twitched. Eliza's breath caught. The forest seemed to lean closer, waiting. Somewhere overhead, a raven cawed, the sound splitting the silence like an omen. James grinned suddenly, a wild, desperate grin that showed the whites of his teeth. Then let's see who walks away. He growled. His fingers brushed the grip of his revolver, and Eliza knew the standoff was about to explode. The air thickened with tension, as though the trees themselves leaned in to listen. The cowboy's hand twitched near his revolver, his boots grinding against the dirt, spurs jangling faintly. Eliza's heart pounded against her ribs, each thud echoing like a drumbeat in her ears. She tugged at the ropes again, skin raw, but they held fast. Fear crawled down her spine, yet beneath it burned something else, an ember of defiance, refusing to let James Carter break her spirit. The warrior finally broke the silence, his voice low and deliberate, the kind of voice that carried both command and memory. I have seen fire take everything I loved, he said, eyes still locked on James. You will not take her. The words struck harder than a bullet. They didn't sound like a threat. They sounded like a vow. James barked a laugh, though it rang hollow in the dusk. You're here because of that night, aren't you? He tilted his head, eyes narrowing as he searched the warrior's face. You think I don't remember? We rode through this land, drove your people out. That was survival. You call it fire, I call it conquest. And now you think you'll stop me over her? He jerked his chin toward Eliza, dismissing her like a bargaining chip. The warrior didn't move, didn't blink. But his eyes darkened, shadows gathering in them like storm clouds. Eliza could see it, the ghosts that lived inside him. And when he spoke again, the weight of those ghosts poured through his words. My sister was 14, he said quietly. Your men dragged her from our lodge. I hear her screams in the wind still. His jaw tightened, muscles twitching. Beneath bronze skin, my father stood with nothing but a bow. He fell with bullets in his chest. My mother's hair burned when you lit our home. You call it conquest, I call it murder. Eliza shivered, not from the cool night air settling in, but from the raw power of his voice. She saw him differently now, not just as a savior who had stepped from the shadows, but as a man carved by loss, carrying the ashes of a past no one had atoned for. James's face hardened, though Eliza caught the flicker of unease there. That was years ago, he muttered, eyes narrowing. A man does what he must to claim his place. Ain't no one cares anymore. You're just clinging to ghosts. The warrior's lips pressed into a thin line. His silence was more damning than words. Eliza's voice broke through before she realized it, her throat dry but her anger steady. He's not clinging to ghosts, James. You are. That one slap was enough to chain you for years. You've built your life around a wound no one else even remembers. You want to talk about ghosts? Look in the mirror. James spun on her, fury lighting his face, the veins in his neck straining. You shut your mouth, he roared. His hand jerked toward his revolver, and for a breath, Eliza thought the world would end in a gunshot. But before he could draw, the warrior stepped forward, closing the distance between them with startling speed. His eyes bore into James's with such ferocity that James's hand froze above the pistol. For a long, unbearable heartbeat, the two men stood so close Eliza thought the air itself would shatter. The warrior spoke again, voice like flint against steel. You think you are owed revenge because she struck you? One hand against your pride? What of the hands that buried my father? What of the flames that devoured my home? Who pays for that, Carter? James's lips parted, but no words came. The bluster had drained from him, his arrogance crumbling beneath the sheer weight of history laid bare before him. The forest seemed to tighten around them. Night had nearly fallen now, the clearing bathed in blue shadow. A wolf's distant howl carried on the wind, long and mournful, as if echoing the warrior's grief. Eliza felt her pulse slow, steadier now. For the first time since being tied to the tree, she saw James falter not as a cruel captor, but as a man cornered by truths. Too heavy to shrug off, but fear twisted in her gut too. She knew James. Pride was his lifeblood. And pride, once pierced, turned desperate. The warrior's vow had shifted the balance. The standoff was no longer about a woman tied to a tree or a slap in a saloon. It had become something larger. The collision of two wounds, one shallow and festering, the other deep and smoldering with fire and ash. And Eliza realized, with a chill running through her bones, that only blood could settle it. The silence cracked like a rifle shot. James Carter's hand snapped to his belt, but instead of drawing the revolver, he pulled a hunting knife from the sheath at his side. Its blade caught what little moonlight filtered through the trees, a silver arc glinting with malice. His grin twisted, feral now, all pretense of swagger burned away. "You want blood for your ghosts?" he spat, teeth bared. "Then you'll get mine or I'll take yours." Before Eliza could scream, James lunged, boots tearing through the dirt, blade aimed straight for the warrior's chest. The warrior didn't move at first. He stood rooted, steady, like the trunk of the very pines around them. Only at the last possible instant did he shift, his arm flashing up with a speed that defied the eye. His hand caught James's wrist mid-strike, stopping the blade inches from his skin. The sound of their collision rang sharp, the scrape of steel against bone, the grunt of effort, the raw clash of strength meeting desperation. James snarled, muscles straining as he tried to force the knife forward, veins bulging in his neck. The warrior's grip held firm, unyielding. With his free hand, he shoved James back, sending him stumbling into the dirt. Eliza's breath hitched. The ropes around her wrists bit deep as she strained against them, eyes wide, watching the two men circle each other. The clearing had become a battlefield. James came up quick, fury painted across his face. He lunged again, knife flashing in the dark, swiping wide, desperate slashes meant not for precision but for dominance. The warrior stepped aside each time, movements fluid and quiet, like a predator conserving energy. His silence was unnerving, every grunt, every curse from James sounded small against it. The cowboy spat, sweat dripping down his temple. "Fight back, damn you!" The warrior did. With one swift motion, he sidestepped another strike and slammed his forearm into James's chest, knocking the wind out of him. James staggered but kept his footing, gasping for air, hatred twisting deeper into his features. Dust swirled at their feet, rising with each stomp and shift, turning the moonlight hazy. The smell of sweat, leather, and pine resin filled the clearing. The forest itself seemed alive, the branches creaking overhead, the earth trembling under the force of their struggle. James swung wild, reckless. The warrior caught his wrist again, twisting it sharply. The knife clattered to the dirt, spinning once before lodging into the ground. For a heartbeat, James froze, stunned by his sudden vulnerability, but desperation drove him. He lunged with his fists now, hammering them into the warrior's chest and jaw. The blows landed heavy, but the warrior absorbed them with the resilience of stone. Then, with a sharp, calculated strike, he drove his own fist into James's stomach. The cowboy folded, breath leaving him in a wheeze. Eliza flinched at the sound, torn between fear and relief. She wanted to close her eyes but couldn't not. when the man who had tormented her for years was finally being stripped of his power. James stumbled back, spitting blood into the dirt, eyes wild. His voice cracked but carried venom. "You think you're better than me? You think you can take what I built? This is my land. My right." The warrior stepped closer, every stride calm, purposeful. He didn't raise his fists, didn't even reach for the knife lying between them. His voice was steady, but his words cut deeper than steel. "You built nothing but graves. Pride has made you blind. Tonight it breaks." James roared and threw himself forward one last time. All his fury, all his shame, all his poisoned pride poured into a final reckless charge. The warrior met him head on. Their bodies collided with a thud that echoed through the trees. Dust rose in a choking cloud. There was no hesitation now, James's pride against the warrior's vow. Fists slamming, muscles straining, the clearing alive with the sound of flesh meeting flesh. For Eliza, time slowed. She felt every second burn into her memory. The crash of bodies, the grunt of effort, the sharp crack of knuckles, the glint of moonlight on sweat and blood. She knew this was more than a fight. It was the breaking point. And when the dust began to settle, only one man would still be standing. James's scream cut through the night as the warrior's grip twisted his wrist, forcing the knife to clatter to the dirt. The metallic clang seemed to echo louder than gunfire, reverberating through the forest clearing. Eliza's breath hitched. Her captor, once smug and untouchable, was suddenly reduced to a man scrambling to hold his footing. The warrior stood tall and unyielding, his long black hair whipping across his face in the cool night breeze, his chest rising and falling steadily like a mountain rooted to the earth. Beads and bone ornaments shimmered faintly in the moonlight with each controlled movement. His silence was more terrifying than rage. It was the calm of a man who had seen blood and loss, who had no need to boast of his strength because vengeance already lived in his bones. James staggered back, clutching his wrist, eyes wild with hatred. "You think you can humiliate me?" He spat, his voice cracking under the weight of frustration. "You think you can take her side after what she did to me?" The warrior said nothing at first. He crouched, slowly picking up the fallen knife, turning it over in his hand as if weighing its history. His dark eyes lifted to James' eyes that seemed to pierce the man's very soul. "You laugh at her pain," the warrior finally said, his voice low and steady, each word striking like a drumbeat. "You tied her to a tree as if she were an animal. You think this makes you strong?" Eliza's throat tightened at his words. No one had ever stood for her like this. She could taste blood from where she had bitten her lip earlier, the copper sting mingling with tears that streaked her dirt-covered cheeks. James straightened, chest heaving, face contorted. "She slapped me. She thought she could shame me in front of the whole town. I'll teach her what happens to people who don't respect James Coulter." He jerked his revolver free from its holster, his hands trembling. Eliza gasped, heart hammering, so loudly it seemed to drown out the forest around them. She pulled against the ropes until her skin burned, helplessly watching the standoff. The warrior didn't flinch. He dropped the knife to the dirt at his feet with deliberate calm. "Guns are for cowards," he said, his tone like iron. "If your pride is wounded by a slap, then your soul is weaker than a child's." James's finger twitched on the trigger, but the warrior moved first. Like a striking hawk, he lunged, his arm a blur, knocking the revolver aside before the hammer could fall. The gun fired into the night, the sound splitting the silence and sending crows shrieking from the treetops. The warrior's other hand crashed into James's chest with the force of a charging bull, sending him sprawling onto the ground. His revolver slid into the dirt, lost in the dark. James coughed, spitting blood, his bravado crumbling with every shallow breath. "You don't understand," he wheezed. "She made a fool of me. I couldn't let it go." The warrior bent. Low, his voice barely more than a whisper, but deadly as a rattler's hiss. A slap is nothing, but your cruelty, that is a wound that stains the earth. He pressed a knee into James's chest, pinning him as easily as a man might pin down a rabbit. Eliza stared, her whole body trembling, torn between fear and a flicker of relief. The ropes still cut into her wrists, but she barely felt them. Her eyes were locked on the two men. Knowing the night's end would decide whether she lived or died, James writhed, rage and desperation twisting across his face. "You don't get to decide my fate," he spat, blood flecking his lips. "She's mine to punish." The warrior's jaw tightened, his dark gaze sweeping briefly toward Eliza. Their eyes met, and in that instant she saw both fury and compassion burning in him, two flames battling in the same heart. "You have already sealed your fate," he sighed, turning back to James. His voice rumbled like distant thunder. "Not with a slap, but with the cruelty of a man who thinks pain makes him powerful." Eliza felt her breath catch again, the weight of the moment pressing down on her chest. She didn't know what the warrior would do next, but the air was so thick with finality that even the forest seemed to hold its breath, waiting. And James, for the first time that night, looked afraid. The gunshot still rang in the air like an echo from the heavens, but it was not the warrior who lay bleeding on the ground. It was James. His own bullet had found its way back to him, his shoulder torn and his rage broken. He clutched the wound. Gasping like a drowning man, his laughter finally silenced. Eliza's heart hammered. Her wrists were raw from the ropes, but the pain was nothing compared to the trembling relief rising inside her. For the first time since being dragged into this nightmare, she saw a glimpse of hope. The warrior stood over James, chest rising and falling like a mountain in motion. Moonlight rippled across his bronzed skin, beads and bone of his tribal necklace swaying with each breath. His long black hair clung to his shoulders, damp with sweat and dust, but his eyes, dark, steady, and unyielding, were locked on James. "You took what was not yours," the warrior said, his voice deep, rolling like thunder through the clearing. "And you thought you could break a spirit with fear." James spat blood into the dirt, his face twisted in bitterness. "She humiliated me, one slap, and the whole town laughed." His voice cracked with a mixture of anger and despair. "I wanted her to pay, to kneel, to remember her place." The warrior's gaze hardened. He knelt down slowly, gripping James by the collar, forcing him to meet his eyes. "A man's honor is not taken by a slap," he said. "It is lost when he seeks vengeance upon the helpless." His words carried more weight than the blow of any fist, an ancient truth drawn from generations before him. James tried to sneer, but the pain robbed him of strength. His hand groped weakly for the revolver in the dirt, but the warrior's foot pressed it aside. The fight was gone from him. Eliza, her breath shallow and shaking, whispered, "Please, just end it. He'll never stop. He'll never let me live." The warrior's eyes flickered toward her, then back to James. A storm of silence held the clearing still. Even the crickets had hushed, as if waiting to hear the verdict. But instead of drawing blood, the warrior released James, letting him slump back into the dust. "Your punishment," he said, "is to live with your shame. You will remember this night not as revenge, but as the moment your pride was broken forever." James's scream tore through the trees, not of pain, but of rage at being denied even the dignity of death. He writhed, clutching his shoulder, but no man was coming to his rescue. No ally, no crowd, no laughter, only the warrior's shadow looming above him. The warrior turned to Eliza. With a swift, powerful motion, he sliced through her ropes with James's own knife. Her wrists burned as freedom returned, and she collapsed into his arms, sobbing into his chest. His strength was solid, unyielding, yet gentle as his hand rested against her trembling back. "You are safe now," he murmured, his voice low, steady as the earth. The forest seemed to exhale with her. A night air, cool and sharp with pine, filled her lungs as if for the first time. Stars glimmered above, unbothered by the cruelty of men, watching silently as justice had been carved in the dirt. Together, they walked away from James, who howled curses into the night like a broken coyote. He was left with nothing but his wound, his bitterness, and the echo of his own failure. By the time dawn began to stretch its golden fingers across the horizon, Eliza and the warrior had reached the edge of the woods. The town lay far beyond, still sleeping. Unaware of the battle that had raged beneath the trees, Eliza turned to the warrior, her voice soft yet steady. "Why did you help me? You didn't even know me." The warrior's eyes lifted toward the mod sunrise as though searching for an answer in the light. "Because," he said, "when someone cries for help, the earth itself hears it, and sometimes it sends someone to answer." She swallowed hard, her throat tight with emotion. His words cut deeper than any blade. For the first time since her ordeal began, she felt the stirrings of strength within herself, strength born from survival, from defiance, from knowing that she had been saved not just from death, but from despair. The warrior gave a final nod, then stepped back toward the forest. His figure, tall and unwavering, seemed almost part of the trees themselves. His long black hair shimmered in the dawn, tribal jewelry catching the new light before he disappeared into the shadows. Eliza stood watching, her heart torn between gratitude and longing. She knew she might never see him again, but his presence had changed her forever. She was no longer just the girl who had been tied to a tree. She was the woman who had endured, who had survived, and who carried within her the echo of a warrior's strength. Behind her, the world was waking. Ahead of her, a new life awaited. And in the silence of the forest, James's bitter cries faded into nothingness.